Thank you so much, Hayley.
You're very welcome.
Oh, there we go. So welcome everyone. Thank you to those of you who could join. I know a lot of my colleagues who will be watching the recording as they are around the world in different time zones, but really nice to see some faces live. My goal today is really to explore why we should involve children in research and how we should do that. So my focus will be specifically on tourism research, which is my area of expertise, but I hope that some of my kind of key takeaways and messages will be relevant across disciplines. I know, at least from my breakout room, we have Anna, who is in public health, and I'm sure we'll be having other listeners listening to the recording who are from different disciplines. So hopefully there will be relevance across disciplines. So in terms of what to expect, I'm going to try and keep it under 30 minutes. So we have time for questions and discussion. I'll start off with a little bit about my personal context, why I'm so passionate about this topic. Then I'll talk a little bit about the global context and where we're at in terms of including children in tourism research. I'll then share 4 reasons why people often tell you not to include children in research, and I'll draw on examples from my PhD to talk about how I address those barriers and how we can overcome some of those challenges. And then we'll end with some takeaways and time for questions. So to start with, why am I so interested in this topic, and why do I believe children should be included in tourism research? I guess it comes back to my own childhood. So that first photo there on the left is of me and my sister, and we traveled a lot as children. And so we were both hugely shaped by our experiences as traveling children. And then that second photo is of me actually, it's not of me. Sorry, I should disclaimer, it's a photo I found. I didn't have any photos of me in Bath, but I grew up in Bath in England, which is a famous tourist destination. Some of you might be familiar with it. And so I was impacted by tourism also as a resident of a famous tourist destination. So I was impacted as both a traveler and as a resident. We had constant streams of visitors from around the world coming to stay with us and in our environment. I now have a daughter who I also see as being influenced by travel. Again, as a traveler, she has traveled with me already a lot since she was just a few months old, because I work in tourism and I work in travel. I've always dragged her along with me on work trips and holidays. And again, she is living in a famous tourist destination, Wellington, Aotearoa, and so we have had many au pairs from different countries, visitors from different countries, and they have shaped the way that she sees the world. In a more kind of professional context, as Ailey mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Good Travel, which is a social enterprise working to transform the tourism industry into a force for good. And one of the areas of our work is that we offer experiences, and many of those are catered for children. So we run trips around the world. You can see a trip there for mothers and daughters in Peru. And we also run a lot of advocacy campaigns, and we actively advocate for travelers to be more conscious of their impact on child residents. So we promote the child safe movement, which is all around being more aware of how we travel and how our travels impact children in destinations. So hopefully through those examples, you can see that travel does impact children. It impacts children who have the privilege of traveling, and it impacts children who live in tourist destinations. So now if we turn to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in Article 12, it clearly states that children have the right to express their views in all matters affecting them. So tourism affects children, and therefore they have the right under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to express their views in how tourism impacts them, and for those views to be taken into consideration in terms of policy and planning. And what's exciting is kind of within the tourism industry, we are starting to see children's views being taken into consideration. And I wanted to share this one example of the Palau Pledge. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but it's a pledge which all visitors to Palau have to sign in their passports. So the pledge is stamped in their passport, as you can see in the bottom photo, and you have to sign it in order to enter Palau. So it's an immigration requirement, and it's a pledge to the children of Palau to protect their home. So it's a responsible traveller pledge, and it's making visitors commit to certain behaviours, positive behaviours while they're in Palau. And not only is it a pledge to the children of Palau, but it was created with the input of children of Palau. So they were consulted through schools in terms of identifying their priorities, the kinds of behaviours they did and didn't want to see from visitors to their country. So a really nice example of children's voices being heard in research and then being incorporated into a really practical outcome. And at the kind of international level, the UN World Tourism Organization is also increasingly recognizing the importance of including children and youth in tourism policy and planning. You can see a quote here from the UNWTO Secretary General, and last year was also the first year that UNWTO held a global youth tourism summit, which was a really exciting event where children and youth from around the world were invited to Italy to talk about tourism and to talk about how tourism had affected them and the kind of future they wanted for the tourism industry. So that will take place again next year, and hopefully we will have representatives from across the globe. There weren't any from New Zealand last year, but we did manage to get 2 youth from the Cook Islands to attend. So the goal for next year is to get even more representatives from New Zealand and the Pacific. So anyone who wants to support with that, let me know. Something I'm quite excited about. So in the industry, we are starting to see some shifts and some recognition of the importance of involving children. Within academia, there is pretty widespread recognition that children's voices have been undervalued by tourism researchers. And that has been kind of consistent, but it's slowly starting to change. So there's some really great advocates in the space, including Antonia Canosa, who's quoted here, who are really pushing and advocating for greater awareness of the distinctive and nuanced contribution that children and young people can make to tourism research, policy and planning. And that is starting to shift things, and we are starting to see more and more academics and practitioners interested in hearing what children have to say in terms of the future that they want for tourism. So as we try to include children more, I think one of the challenges that we face is that people tell us all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't include children. And this was certainly my experience with my PhD. So my PhD is looking at the core research question you can see on this slide of how contact with host communities during travel can shape children's sense of global citizenship. And so I'm focused on children as visitors, absolutely recognize the importance of also doing research with children as residents, but due to kind of the limitations of a PhD and how much can be included, my focus was on children as visitors. And as I was designing my PhD proposal, I received a lot of comments and advice from well-meaning academics, people working in education around the challenges that I was going to face with my research. So I want to draw from my PhD to kind of tell you some of those things that came up for me and how I've addressed them in my research. So just a bit more background about my PhD first. I ended up conducting 60 interviews. All of them were online, and they were with children of 11 and 12 years old. My intention was not to do them online, but I was conducting them during COVID restrictions, so that's why I ended up doing them online. My supervisors are here at Victoria University of Wellington, Dr. Ina Reichenberger and Professor Karen Smith. And I also have a youth advisory group, which I'll talk about later, and an external group of child-centered research experts. Both of those groups have been incredibly helpful in providing different perspectives and things that I need to take in consideration with my research. As you can see, my child-centered research advisory group are from quite diverse, both public and private sector organizations, Oranga Tamariki, Ministry for Children, Bernardo's, and the Ethical Research Involving Children project. So this is where I'm going to be drawing my examples from. But again, I think even if you're not in tourism, many of these challenges that I share will be relevant to you. So the first thing that everyone said to me when I said I wanted to do research involving children was, don't do it. Your ethics application will be a nightmare. You're trying to get your PhD done in 3 years. It's going to hold you up. And yeah, you're gonna have a tough time with ethics. There is a lot to think about with ethics, and it's certainly not something to kind of be dismissed. But on the upside, there are some really great resources out there. I've just shared 2 here along the bottom. The first is childethics.com, which has the most amazing resources available to you when thinking about some of these core issues I've got across the top here in terms of harms and benefits, privacy and confidentiality, informed consent, payment and compensation. It's a global resource, and yeah, really made my ethics application much smoother. There's also national level organizations and resources that will be really helpful for you. In New Zealand, the Office of the Children's Commissioner has some really great resources on their website. And so, although there's a lot to think about, and these are things you would be thinking about anyway in terms of research with adults, is just trying to look at it through a different lens and really being thoughtful about how you approach your ethics. And one kind of key takeaway for me with the ethics process, and for me, it was really important to kind of be at the forefront of advancing ethical research with children. So not just kind of ticking the boxes, but actually really trying to make this a positive experience for my participants. And at the end of each interview, I asked my participants how it felt being interviewed. And the words that kind of kept coming up with things like weird, strange, you know, that they were nervous. And I think for the majority of my participants, this was a completely new experience for them. And that's very different to doing research with adults who have often been in at least something that's vaguely comparable. But having an adult appear on their screen and ask them questions about themselves was a completely new experience. And so taking that into consideration, particularly in terms of informed consent and what that looks like, and how do you genuinely get informed consent from children. So there's a lot more I could talk about there. If anyone's interested, feel free to reach out. But I'll continue on to the second challenge, which came up a lot, was around participant recruitment. So everyone was asking me, you know, how are you going to find children participants? Families are incredibly busy, schools are incredibly busy. You're going to have a really hard time getting participants for your study. There's obviously lots of ways you can recruit participants. In my case, I decided to go through schools, but I used schools as a way to raise awareness for my research. But then I communicated directly with families once they'd expressed an interest in participating. And in that way, it was quite easy for schools to support my research. All I was asking them for was to include an image in their school newsletter, or put something on their website, or print a letter off to put in children's school bags. So I gave them lots of different ways that they could support, and made it as easy as possible for them by giving them what they needed to do it. Nonetheless, you can see here, I contacted 375 schools and 32 agreed to promote. So, and from that, I ended up with my 30 participants. So it was somewhat time consuming, but yeah, making it easy for schools and also providing them with an incentive was really important. So I included all schools that agreed to promote my research in a lucky draw, and they had the chance to win a voucher for their library. Also, it's worth mentioning that I was doing this in the middle of COVID, so schools were incredibly busy, and I think at other times it might not have been quite so challenging, but it sounds like that was a lot of work. Actually, it was a mail merge email to lots of schools, and so it was certainly possible to recruit participants. And once families had contacted me, it was really quite straightforward to get them involved, and I had quite low dropout of families once they contacted me and expressed interest. The third barrier that's frequently talked about is methods and the challenges around collecting data with children. I would say it's not necessarily harder, but it does need to be different, right? We can't use the same methods that we would use with adults in terms of how we collect information from children. In my opinion, it's way more fun doing research with children, and it really gives you an opportunity to be quite creative and to trial out different ways of collecting data. Sorry, I'm in an office where the light turns off, so I have to wave now and again. So the first question, if you are considering carrying out research involving children, that you want to ask yourself is how do you view children, and how do you want them to be part of your research? And there's a whole area of literature called childhood studies, which is really, really valuable to look at. And childhood studies is basically highlighting how, traditionally we view children as research subjects, and we would carry out research on children. And childhood studies is really advocating for us to move along this continuum to recognizing children as experts in their own lives, as social actors with agency, and potentially even as researchers themselves. And so it's possible to involve children within your research team, to involve them in co-authoring publications and that kind of thing. So quite a shift in terms of how we view children and how we involve them in research. In the case of my study, I was kind of in the middle of this continuum. So I defined my PhD as child-centered, and it includes elements of both research about children and research with children. In terms of the research with children, I mentioned that I have an advisory group. So I have 3 children who have been involved in all stages of my PhD. So I first met with them when I was designing my research methods, and they were incredibly valuable in terms of providing feedback on my pilot interview and really helping to shape the way that I designed my interview format. I met with them again during data analysis, which is where these photos are from. They're helping me organize my themes. And I'll meet with them again during data dissemination to ensure that my research has really positive outcomes for children and not just for academics. And as I mentioned, I interviewed 30 children. So I interviewed each child twice, which is why I ended up with 60 interviews. And these are just some photos to cheer us up because it's winter. But these are some of the destinations that they had traveled to. So I was interviewing children who had traveled overseas in the past 5 years, and they were recalling their experiences. So they had traveled anywhere in the world in the past 5 years. In terms of kind of specifics around research methods, there's a lot I could talk about, but I'll just share a few kind of key takeaways, I guess, from my experiences. The first was around the importance of icebreakers to get the interview process going. So you can see from this quote from one of my participants that she felt nervous at the start of the interview, but the icebreaker helped her to feel more comfortable. And that was consistent across all my participants. So I was concerned, with the 11 to 12 age range, that some might feel a bit too cool to be doing icebreaker activities and that kind of thing. But consistently, they all said that they enjoyed the icebreaker and kind of highlighted it as something that they really appreciated about the interview. I also tried to include really diverse activities to keep my participants engaged. So my original in-person interview format, which I had intended to do pre-COVID, was all within one interview. But when I realized I had to do it online, I decided to split it across 2 interviews and include as many kind of interactive activities as was possible online. So children had the options of drawing, and we did polls, which is not what you would use normally on a one-on-one conversation, but it was just, again, a different way of engaging them and giving them time to kind of think about their responses to certain opinion questions. And then we did brainstorms using Zoom whiteboard and that kind of thing. So trying to keep things interesting and different rather than just kind of a traditional interview format. These are some quotes from some of my youth advisors when I was designing the methodology. Casper talked about children being easily bored. Cameron had a really interesting point, which was around drawing. So drawing has been used a lot in other studies which have involved children as a way to collect data and to kind of start conversations. But she actually suggested that some participants might not want to draw, and that there's a lot of pressure in schools around whether you're good at drawing or not good at drawing. And so she said it was important to make it optional, which I did. And so some participants chose to, and actually most didn't want to draw. So that was interesting. And then Nia was talking about the activities like the polls, where I was giving children an opportunity to kind of stop and think and look at things as opposed to always having to say their opinions out loud. And then the fourth and final barrier that I want to mention, which again was frequently highlighted when I was developing my proposal and meeting with different people, was around data quality. And the first point there is, how will you know if kids are remembering things accurately? This was actually a question I had during my proposal presentation when I was defending my proposal from an academic. And it was something that came up a lot. And my argument is that it actually doesn't matter if children are remembering things accurately, right? As a qualitative researcher, I was interested in children's perceptions and how they interpreted their experiences. And so I didn't need to check if that was accurate as to what specifically happened. It was their perception, and therefore it was quality data in my mind. And the other thing I got a lot was that people thought kids will just say, I don't know, to everything I ask them, or they'll only want to talk about the pool that they swam in all holiday, and that I wouldn't be able to collect any kind of rich or in-depth data with children of 11 to 12 years old. That proved to be completely false. Out of my 30 interviews, I had one participant, which I kind of struggled with in terms of a lot of I don't knows and short answers. All the others, I really got in-depth data, and you can see there, I did not have an issue around quantity of data at all. And so I think that reflects the quote there from my youth advisor, is that kids are actually excited if an adult wants to hear their opinions and really cares about what they think, and they have a lot to say. So related to that, and kind of why I feel that I was successful in collecting in-depth data from my participants, was I was constantly reflecting on them as individuals and on their well-being as individuals. So this relates to ethics, but it also relates to collecting quality data. And so I didn't even really realize I was doing this until I was analyzing things later. But essentially, I was trying to enhance my participants' well-being through their participation in the interview process. So some of you might be familiar with self-determination theory, which basically says that all human beings, independent of age, of culture, of nationality, have 3 basic needs to ensure that we have a sense of psychological well-being. And the first of those is competence. And so through the interview process, I was working to ensure that my participants felt competent. As I said, many of them were nervous. They had never done anything like this before. And so I was constantly encouraging them and reinforcing them that what they were telling me was really useful. A lot of them did express quite a bit of self-doubt when they couldn't remember things, for example, and I would tell them that, you know, the fact that they didn't remember was in itself useful data. So constantly highlighting their competence and making them feel useful. The second was around autonomy. So all human beings need to feel a sense of control over our lives, over our behaviors. And again, that was something I was trying to reinforce through the interview process. Early on, through the consent process, you know, saying this is voluntary, like this is your choice to participate, and communicating that in a way that was child appropriate. But also through the interview itself, kind of reminding kids that they didn't need to answer questions if they didn't want to, and that they didn't need to participate in energizers if they didn't want to, and giving them different choices. And it was really encouraging actually to see my participants asserting their autonomy. One of them, I asked them a question, they're like, I'm not going to answer that, right? That's my right, you know, and they were really kind of embracing that, which was great. And then the third one, which I think was especially important in kind of the online interview format, was around relatedness. So we need to feel a sense of relatedness to feel psychological well-being. And in the context of an online interview, that was quite hard. And so what I did was, even before the first interview started, I sent my participants like a welcome video where I shared information about myself, about my family, about my cat, and kind of tried to make myself come across as a real human. And then in the first interview, really using that first interview to connect with my participants and not being overly concerned in the first interview about the data I was collecting. Really using that to help participants feel comfortable, so that then in the second interview, I could delve into some of those really challenging questions that I wanted their perceptions on. So that's kind of what I wanted to share in terms of 4 barriers that I came across and how I address them. And so just to wrap up, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. My top 3 takeaways for any of you considering doing research involving children is, firstly, that although children have the right to express their views, as we saw in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, their voices continue to be undervalued, and it's really time that we change that. And secondly, that children are experts in their own lives and a rich source of information and ideas. They're not just mini adults, you know, they have their own experiences, their own interpretations right now, which are really helpful and different to the kinds of understandings and ideas that we can get from adults. And lastly, that participating in research should support children's well-being. And so that's something which is really important to me personally, in terms of the ethical side, but also, as I shared there in that previous slide, a way in which to collect really valuable and in-depth data from participants. So just to end, coming back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, children have a right to express their opinions in matters affecting them, and they really want to, was what I came out of my research realizing. So Isabel there, one of my participants, was saying that she liked knowing that someone actually wanted to know something about her. Her family obviously was interested in her, but mostly other adults are not particularly interested in sitting down and asking children about their opinions on things. And so they want to participate in research. So let's give them the opportunity to. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening. I'll hand back to you, Ailey and Berta.